Hi, everyone. I'm Casey Satteray. I'm the Donor Stewardship and Social Media Coordinator for Washington's National Park Fund. For those of you who are new here, WNPF is the official philanthropic partner for Mount Rainier, North Cascades, and Olympic National Parks. Our staff and board of directors work hard to support the parks in so many ways. We're fortunate to have a strong engagement with the parks and the park superintendents as we work to fund a lot of priority projects every single year. Throughout all of this work, our vision is to see that our parks are strong and vibrant, youthful, and everlasting. Today marks our 40th virtual field trip since March of 2020. Since then, our virtual field trips have evolved to once a month rather than once a week, which was a lot back then. Our virtual field trips have been used as an educational material for volunteers, students. They've been an escape for all of us while we've been at home, stuck during the pandemic. And of course, it was a great way for us all to see where our fundraising has been put to use in the parks. Thank you for joining us on all of these virtual field trips. And it really has exceeded our expectations. Now, before we start, there are a few housekeeping items. This field trip is 45 minutes with a 30-minute presentation from our speaker, and then there's a Q&A at the end of the show. Feel free to enter any questions in the box as we go. And as always, there's closed captioning available, which you can access at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We welcome any feedback as we work to make these trips as accessible as possible. Okay, so who is ready to board the virtual bus to Olympic National Park? Chelsea Behymer is an environmental educator, naturalist, and sea kayak guide who is currently pursuing her PhD in informal science education. When she isn't doing research or writing, she's exploring the Olympic Peninsula alongside her partner, Chris, a professional whitewater kayaker and photographer. We are really looking forward to learning from Chelsea and Chris. So with that, take it away, Chelsea.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Casey, for that introduction. And thank you so much to the Washington Parks National Fund for inviting me to share with you all this unique perspective of what has grown to be one of my favorite places on Earth, in addition to one of my favorite national parks. And I just have really immense gratitude for the fact that I can now call the Olympic Peninsula home. So I'm very excited to share with you this perspective of Olympic National Park. And my partner, Chris, is a big part of sharing this perspective. So he'll pop in a bit to introduce himself. And you'll see several of his images and videos throughout the presentation. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. And here we go. All right, so my intention today is to explore the natural history that has and continues to shape this really, really unique landscape, all essentially from the perspective of the immense watersheds that simultaneously transect and connect this really incredible landscape. Including all of its people, animals, plants, and habitats. So I realize that 30 minutes is a pretty short amount of time to talk about all of the natural history of the peninsula. So I'm really just highlighting some key things that we've found, or I've found, can be observed in a different way from the water and from a particular watershed with which folks out there may be able to recognize this particular river in this photo. So Casey's been so generous to set up a few poll questions. So if any of you can name this particular river that's in the photo, just click yes, oh, I recognize that river. You don't have to know which one or say it in the poll, or maybe you're not sure. So go ahead and click on the poll, yes or not yet. So I'll give you a hint that you can see part of Olympic National Park in this photo, but of course the river flows beyond Olympic. Awesome. So it looks like some of you recognize this river, but a lot of you aren't quite sure which river this photo is of. So I'm excited to share more about this river. This is the ELWHA River. So if you thought this was the ELWHA River, you are correct. This view of the ELWHA comes from Dan Kelly Ridge, which is really close to where I live, and one of my favorite views of this particular watershed. So I'll be focusing on the ELWHA River as kind of our water perspective of Olympic National Park's natural history. Let's see. So renowned author and naturalist Tim McNulty has described the Olympic Peninsula as a veritable island of rivers. And when we look at this map, where it highlights the immense watersheds that all radiate out from the Olympic Mountains and flow to the ocean in every direction, we can definitely appreciate this metaphor. But while rivers dominate that view of the landscape, how I have fallen in love with the Olympic Peninsula has been from the perspective of the ocean that surrounds this island of rivers, in particular, the interior waters of British Columbia and the state of Washington. So that's partly why I included in the title the Salish Sea. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the Salish Sea is a collective descriptor of these interior waters, which includes the Strait of Juan de Fuca, the Puget Sound, and the Strait of Georgia. So the Salish Sea is really unique for a number of reasons. It's absolutely beautiful. It's home to an incredible abundance of marine life. So as a marine biologist by training, I have just been fascinated by these waters and spent a lot of time sea kayaking here. Just a fun fact for you all, it's not just visibly productive, it is scientifically known that the Salish Sea waters, the interior waters of Puget Sound, are on average more productive than even the outer coastal waters of California and Oregon. And this is because of some relatively new research has actually highlighted that we have this incredible amount of nutrient-rich deep water that's continually being pumped in by a submarine canyon that's just off of the entrance of the Strait of Juan de Fuca. So this process of upwelling of really nutrient-rich deep ocean water is typical on the coast of Oregon and California, but it's wind-driven, and we don't have that kind of regular offshore wind off the coast of Washington here, or the coast of the peninsula, but instead we have this submarine canyon that's pumping in these waters, and they're transported through the Strait of Juan de Fuca and throughout the Salish Sea. So these coastal waters are intricately connected to life on land, which is why I want to highlight them. This photo is of a river otter, actually, not a sea otter. But this river otter is in the ocean, and river otters typically thrive in freshwater systems, and they make their homes on land. But here on the Olympic Peninsula, there are healthy populations of river otters that regularly go fishing in the ocean, even though they live on land. In fact, most of the river otter encounters that I've experienced have been pretty close to the mouth of the ELWHA River. So my appreciation for the ELWHA River in particular, so this is a photo of where the Glines Canyon Dam used to be, looking down on the now free-flowing ELWHA, is not just because the ELWHA is in my backyard here in Port Angeles, but also because of another river otter of sorts. So my partner, Chris Korbulik, which Casey mentioned in the introduction, is a professional whitewater kayaker and photographer, and he has dedicated much of the last 2 years to exploring the Olympic Peninsula's rivers, and in particular, the less accessible portions of these rivers, and has been wonderful in sharing this really unique experience with me. And I've pieced it together with my understanding of coastal systems to share with you all what the natural history can look like from the water. So to give you a sense of Chris's level of adventure on the peninsula, I'll just share another photo of him paddling over. For those of you who are wondering if that is Solduck Falls, you are correct. So Chris, do you want to just share your video real quick and say hello? No,
Yeah, can you see me? Anybody? Hello?
You're good, Chris.
Yeah, okay. Hey, sorry about that confusion. I may be pretty comfortable on the rivers, but not always on the computer here. But thanks for the intro, both Casey and Chelsea. That's wonderful. Really looking forward to the rest of your conversation here with us about the rivers and see what we can all learn. And I'm excited to share a little bit more about my experience up in the headwaters of some of these rivers, but we are not quite there yet. We'll get there soon. I think. Go ahead, Chelsea, and we'll come back to me when the time comes.
Perfect. Yeah, so if you have questions specifically for Chris that you want to put in the chat, we'll both be on at the end to answer questions. I think some of the images and video clips I'll share will prompt some questions. So just know that he'll be here for that as well. And yeah, so see, what do I have next? So it's through our shared enthusiasm for this place and exploring it experientially that we've sort of taken turns immersing ourselves in each other's, preferred water mediums. So myself, not as much on the whitewater, but certainly along the river banks of these major watersheds. And Chris has even tagged along on several sea kayaking adventures. And we have just absolutely fallen in love with this landscape from the lens of the water. We've shared some of our adventures with friends in a little bit of a more accessible way. So this photo is actually on the Hump Tulips River, and these are pack rafts, so they're inflatable kayaks that are much easier to hike along the trails that go upstream to reach the upper portions of these rivers. You can put them in a backpack and inflate them. So not quite at Chris's level of whitewater kayaking, but maybe more accessible. So we do realize that experiencing this place from the river perspective in this way isn't accessible to everyone, at least not right now, or there's a steep learning curve if you're interested. But our goal or our hope today is that this unique perspective maybe inspires you to look at Olympic National Park as well as other parks in a different way, or maybe it might pique your interest in a new type of adventure. So we will get back to the ELWHA River, but I wanted to start by zooming in on a much shorter drainage that is connected to the ELWHA, or historically connected to the ELWHA, to really give us a sense of how looking at a place in this perspective can help us appreciate how it changes over time. So I'm curious if anyone recognizes this body of water featured in the photo. So not necessarily where I'm standing. So it looks like we have a pole here. So I gave you a few options of what you think this body of water might be, to give folks a moment to think about it or take a wild guess. All right, awesome. It looks like most of you recognize this body of water. It is in fact Lake Crescent, and I'm standing on top of Mount Storm King, which is a fantastic view of these incredible waters. Most folks appreciate Lake Crescent along the shoreline from Olympic National Park. And no matter how you experience Lake Crescent, the most stunning feature by far are its crystal clear emerald colored waters. And if you have the opportunity ever to experience Crescent Lake on the water, I highly recommend it. It doesn't require any sort of formal whitewater kayaking experience. It's flat, calm water. So it might be the best opportunity for folks who might not be comfortable in a kayak to have their first kayak perspective of Lake Crescent. But these crystal clear waters are obvious wherever you experience it. And these crystal clear waters are an indication of how nutrient poor the lake is. So the lake itself actually doesn't support very much life. Very few fish. There are a few species that are endemic to the lake, so found nowhere else, but they're relatively small. Their populations are small because there's not very much food. But what I find really interesting is this hasn't always been the case. So the waters we know of today as Lake Crescent used to be connected as one large body of water with Lake Sutherland. And as one large body of water, the main outflow was a tributary into the ELWHA River. So indeed, as a tributary of the ELWHA River, it's very likely that salmon, anadromous salmon, once were present in Crescent Lake, not necessarily feeding there, but potentially spawning in some of the shallower portions or smaller tributaries that now feed into Lake Crescent. So what happened? Satellite imagery and geology demonstrate that there's a massive debris flow, which you can see as the yellow landslide highlighted portion on the right-hand side of the screen. And this debris flow now separates the two, so Lake Crescent and Lake Sutherland. So a debris flow of this size is most likely from a large landslide that was triggered by a huge earthquake. And further evidence of this large-scale acute event to cause this landslide and separate the now two bodies of water is corroborated in indigenous oral histories here. So by separating Lake Crescent from what's now Lake Sutherland, where the outflow used to kind of head east toward the ELWHA, this blocked off these waters from having anywhere to drain. So the level of the lake rose and eventually gravity took hold and the waters found a new path to flow toward the ocean. So here's an image that just shows a little bit more that landslide you can see from satellite imagery. So you can also see this landslide or where it's now covered in forest. So it's hard to see that the rocks are different, but it's coming off of kind of close to Mount Storm King. And I took this photo from Pyramid Peak, which is on the other side of the lake. So the green arrow on the left is pointing where I took that photo from. And then the next arrow is going to point out where now the Lyre River is the main outflow from Lake Crescent. And it flows about 7 miles out into the Strait of Juan de Fuca. So the Lyre River is not runnable, according to Chris. It's a pretty small, narrow river where the waterfalls and cascades just plummet onto super jagged rocks. And this is because there hasn't been enough time for this river to really carve and smooth out the bedrock, because this landslide happened roughly 10,000 years ago, it's estimated, which is actually a pretty short amount of time in the formation history of a river. So it needs more time to become something like the ELWHA. Another way we can look at this by surfing at the mouth of the Lyre River or hiking down to view the mouth. This is one of my other favorite ways to experience this place on the water, but it's pretty distinctly sediment laden at the mouth year round. At the mouth of the older, larger river systems around the peninsula, you'll see sediment-rich waters during peak flow seasons when there are heavy rains. So late fall, early winter, late spring, early summer. And this is because there's high rains, so there's a little bit more erosion, but they're pretty clear the rest of the year. The Lyre is sediment laden year round because it's so early in its formation, it's continually eroding out the landscape and getting down to the bedrock. So just a fun way to kind of piece together from source to sea and back again to put the story together of how a watershed is formed and how it changes over time. So let's zoom out to the ELWHA. The ELWHA is the largest watershed in Olympic National Park. It's not the largest watershed on the Olympic Peninsula, but certainly is in the park. And it does also flow out to the Salish Sea into the Strait of Juan de Fuca. Now, Chris has explored in depth the journey that water takes from its source at the ELWHA snow finger, so up high in the Olympic Mountains out to the ocean. But it's an incredibly challenging way and takes a long time and a lot of effort to experience the whole ELWHA from source to sea. So in this photo on the left, he's hiking his boat up the Quinault Valley on the other side to reach the source of the ELWHA before paddling it out to the ocean. But I've just recently discovered this new resource that you all can actually access, and I'll put a link into the chat at the end of the presentation. It's called River Runner, and you can, so I'm going to stop sharing that for a moment and pull up my Google here, and you can actually put a raindrop anywhere on the globe, and you can follow its journey from where it starts to where it reaches the ocean. So it'll take a second to load here. So it's hooking up to Google Earth, and I've input that I put a raindrop at the snow finger at the start of the ELWHA River. So it's going to zoom in to the Olympic Mountains. So you can see Olympic National Park, high elevation. So that's where the water starts, and it flows down through some really tight canyons and some wider valleys and tightens up again. So about a 40-mile journey all the way out to the ocean, which I think is so cool to be able to follow that journey, but also gives us an appreciation for what a journey it is and how much this river has carved through the landscape over time. So that was fun. I'll definitely share that in the chat later. So let's get back to the presentation. So, all right. Back to that. Okay. So from the headwaters, so those higher elevation and in the tight canyons where it's too vertical, it's too high in elevation for plants to really grow, we can see really closely the bedrock. So the foundation of this whole Olympic Peninsula system. And I really wanted to zoom in here because on display in these gorges are the beautiful upended layers that are part of what we call the core rocks that make up much of the Olympic mountain range. So these are ancient sedimentary rocks that were formed at the bottom of the ocean millions of years ago. So the National Park Service website for Olympic Peninsula has some great resources on this, and I actually pulled this image from that website, which is a demonstration I've seen in many different food forms, from Oreo cookies to graham crackers with peanut butter, basically demonstrating how the oceanic plates diving underneath the North American continent cause sedimentary layers, so layers of marine sediments that have consolidated under the weight of the ocean over time are getting scraped off and turned on end and jumbled and metamorphosed onto the continent to form the Olympic Mountains. So that's an incredible oversimplification of an amazing process. So if you're interested in more detailed understanding of this process over time, We can talk about that later because or another time because I don't have enough time for it here. But this image shows kind of some ancient volcanic rocks that emerged under the surface of the ocean before any of this material was scraped off onto the North American continent. So we do have volcanic rocks in the Olympics as well, but these were formed before any of this material was above the surface of the ocean. So this simplistic map shows kind of this way these different types of rocks are oriented on the peninsula, and the arc of volcanics that were rafted early on, which I mentioned before, are in purple, and then the green those are the core rocks, so the really ancient marine sediments that form those beautiful upended layers. I also want to point out the kind of purpley blue. These are also marine sedimentary rocks, but they're younger. And so it's pretty common to find marine fossils. So I've seen lots of fossil evidence when I've been sea kayaking out in the Strait of Juan de Fuca. So that's the difference. They're not as consolidated and younger. So I might skip this part now just for the sake of time, but I just want to note there are some little pockets of volcanics that you can see sea kayaking, and just an evidence of how much friction and folding and mixing happened over time through that process of subduction and those accretion zones scraping off. So really fun things you can look at from the perspective of the water and wonder about, and kind of with a general sense of the natural history can start to piece together what's going on. But moving downstream, where the river grows and widens its course over time, forests cover up the bedrock. So you can't really see the geology, but you can absolutely appreciate more of the ecology here. This process takes a lot of time to form these immense forests. So when the glaciers retreated, exposing bedrock, the earliest plants, pioneer plants like alders and spruces, kind of pop up. But they also need help from things like lichens, which help soil to accumulate. And lichens are an amazing example of a symbiotic relationship between algae and fungus. So working together, growing on a barren surface that has nothing to offer, and providing a foundation for so many other life forms to eventually evolve and grow and thrive. So lichen remind me a lot of the relationship between dinoflagellates and algae in corals as a marine person. And this slide is also my reminder to get us back to talking about the ocean, because the ocean has such an incredible influence on the mountains themselves. Even though the rivers flow to the ocean, the source of the water initially comes from the ocean. So it's this full circle cycle. This is the orographic effect, where the prevailing westerly atmospheric systems bring a ton of moisture that precipitate out onto the continually growing Olympic mountains. So the geology is continuous. The Olympic mountains are still growing, but the rate of uplift is matched by the rate of erosion from the incredible amount of precipitation we have, particularly on the western side of the Olympic mountains. Even the lower areas receive a lot of precipitation in the form of fog drifts. So this is a significant factor as well. So lots of time, lots of rain, and a mild climate work together to produce dense forests. And the more time, the more moisture, the more complex this system gets. But I also want to highlight that these incredible forests we have, I love this screenshot from a video clip of Chris's, because these massive trees are put into perspective with the scale of this kayaker. But these immense forests, there's something else beyond just the precipitation that support our forests here. So I'm curious, I just had a little poll if folks are familiar with the concept of salmon in the trees. So, or are aware of some of this research that's come out of the Pacific Northwest, but has also been done elsewhere. So if you've never heard of this concept, or maybe you've heard of it, but you aren't really sure what it means, or maybe you are very familiar and you've heard lots about it. I'm just curious. Let's see. Oh, wow. Okay, so we've kind of got half. So a lot of folks have never heard of it. Some of you are very familiar. So salmon in the trees is essentially what we now understand to be a critical phenomenon here in our forest. So salmon are anadromous fishes. So they start their life history in the rivers here on the peninsula, and after they spawn, they actually spend, or after they're hatched out, they actually spend most of their adult life out in the ocean, where they are building up energy. They're eating lots of food out in the ocean, but then they return to their terrestrial systems, the rivers where they were born, and most species die. So they are an incredible source of what we call marine derived nutrients. And what we've found is that the forests adjacent to salmon spawning streams grow faster, they're healthier, there are larger trees. So it's really just this full circle, not just of water, but of resources and energy as well. So if you're interested in more of that research, I can perhaps provide some follow-up resources in the Q&A or with email later on. Okay, so this journey emphasizing the connection between inland and coastal ecosystems, mountain to the sea and back again, has been honored since time immemorial by Indigenous people of the Olympic Peninsula, and that still continues today as a tradition. On the ELWHA, the construction of dams halted this flow of water and river resources connecting these systems for over 100 years. And the story in particular of the ELWHA River is really unique. And if folks are interested in learning more, you don't know very much, there are a lot of amazing documentaries about it, and it's an ongoing story. But I'm also just curious, so I think my last little poll question here is if folks visited Olympic National Park before the dam removal, or you've only visited after the dams were removed, or maybe some of you have seen the river since, well, both before and after. Cool. So a lot of you have seen it both before and after the dam, so removal. And for those of you who haven't, there are lots of great resources, imagery that can help you appreciate how it's changed. I think what I want to just highlight, because I know we're kind of up for time here, is that what stood out to both Chris and myself, I think I can speak for Chris here, is that this whole story is an incredible example of how communities of very different values, whether they're recreational or subsistence or ecological or traditional or so many other values, took so many years of discussion, but ultimately came to the understanding that these values all hinge on the same thing, and that is the health of this incredible watershed. So dam removal has allowed the river to begin to reclaim its influence on the landscape, and has also given us pause to reflect on what it means to manage resources. So I just want to end on kind of this food for thought that Olympic National Park protects a lot of wilderness, and wilderness means many things to many people, but it is important when we look at the perspective of rivers that these protected areas aren't actually separate. Rivers physically connect them all. What happens outside of a wilderness area impacts within, and vice versa. And this kind of no boundaries can really be appreciated when you're experiencing things from the water. So it's important to understand that wilderness isn't just a place for visitors. People have been a part of the Olympic Peninsula forever. So since the glaciers retreated from this landscape and exposed it initially to plants and animals, people have been here interacting with the landscape. So we continue to play a role in its future. So I'm going to skip over this part, and maybe I can share that in an email following up, because my last little thought here, the rivers that connect us and the ELWHA has supported a change in commitment among diverse people to find balance and common ground. And the positive outcomes of this effort have been evidenced only immediately. So I'm really excited to continue to learn more about this place from the water, especially as the ELWHA kind of reclaims its former route and develops new connections. And I hope that you all are inspired to look at this place a little bit differently, and maybe a different park differently. One of the most recent ways Chris and myself have decided to appreciate this perspective is not just on top of the water, but actually immersing ourselves in the water. And that's been really fun and enlightening as well. So thank you for your time here. I'm sorry I didn't leave as much time for Q&A, but that is all that we have. And I'm going to hand it back over to Casey to kind of tell us what's been going on in the chat.
Thank you so much, Chelsea. I'm excited to hear everyone's questions about this presentation. I'm sure everyone's brewing something up good. That's good. I actually have a really interesting one that I think Chris answered on the side here, but I'm going to pose it to both of you just so everyone can hear the answer. So Mark asked, what is the situation with the wild Olympic legislation, including designating several rivers within the park as wild and scenic? This bill has seemed to pass in the House, but then dies in the Senate when it's removed from the defense bill. Will this bill ever pass? Will we ever get our Olympic Peninsula wild and scenic rivers?
Thank you for that question, Mark. And I'm going to hand this one to Chris. This is why he's here. He's actually been working directly with American Whitewater on the campaign. So I'm going to let Chris answer that.
Yeah. Yeah. So as Chelsea mentioned, I have been working with a national conservation organization called American Whitewater, concerning themselves with rivers and access, basically conservation of rivers for us to enjoy and for those who depend on them. And I think one thing I mentioned at the end of my written answer to Mark is to contact our state representatives, which is so important. You know, and he noted that it has been removed from a defense bill. It's the National Defense Authorization Bill. That's something that has to get passed every year or every couple years. And it's been a way that I think a lot of organizations and lobbying groups have had success getting some public lands bills and other kind of niche legislation passed, and it hasn't quite worked with this huge package of legislation. So the big package that the Wild Olympics legislation is a part of also includes a bunch of other stuff in California, Oregon, other wilderness in Washington. So it's a big package. It's really important, and the Senate just hasn't quite taken it up individually yet. There's always optimism that it will take it up in the next legislative session. Apparently they're busy with other things right now. So they just haven't been able to do it yet. But yeah, one thing that can encourage them to do that is for anybody, wherever you live. You know, in Washington, it's great because our state representatives support this, or a few of our state representatives support this legislation. But anywhere you are, you can write to call your state representatives and encourage them to take a look at this too. And one of my American Whitewater used one of my images in a postcard that I think is still available on their website. If you want to get sent one of these, and then you can share it, you can send it to your representative, encourage them to put a little bit more energy into the bill. And I think that is definitely a really important thing for us to do.
Nice, thank you, Chris. I also have a question. So this is such a unique activity in the parks that I'm sure a lot of people don't usually see every day. I'm sure you run into some folks who are kind of confused as to what you're doing with these kayaks, and maybe I'm even questioning if you're allowed to do what you're doing. What's the process of planning your river trips in tandem with the rules of the park and Leave No Trace?
Yeah, absolutely. Really good question too. And of course, like walking up a trail, 15 miles from the trailhead carrying a kayak, definitely have to field many questions to anybody who's up there. There are generally a lot more questions to answer in the first mile or couple miles of a trail. But once we get a lot deeper, then the questions definitely intensify. But the process for kayaking in the park is much the same as planning any kind of backpacking trip in the park or in the wilderness. So having having permits is a really big important thing, and it's been kind of complicated over the last couple of years with COVID. There's been so much more demand for wilderness permits in the park, so it does require a bit of planning ahead, especially on some of the more popular trails, because we use the same trails to access the rivers as folks do to go backpacking up the ELWHA or up the Quinault or up the Hoh. So just following the same principles of anybody backpacking, of carrying out all of our trash, having bear protection, and trying to leave the place generally better than we found it. And I've definitely carried out, one nice thing about a kayak is that it fits a lot of stuff in it, and once we're not carrying it up the trail, there's a lot of room to bring stuff down the river. So I've taken out, I often take out any trash that I find up on the trails or next to the river, because unfortunately with more people using the parks, that is a reality, that stuff is going to end up on the ground, and then it's going to end up in the rivers. So it just always makes me sad to see that in the rivers. So it's important to try to follow those principles and do the best we can to leave it better than we found it.
That's awesome. Thank you, Chris. Okay, I'm gonna see, Chelsea, if you can answer this question live real quick, just before we end.
Sure.
Chandler asked, the ELWHA dams were here for hundreds of years. That's about 15 generations of salmon. How can the salmon now remember the spawning route of their 15th great parent to come to the ELWHA headwaters?
Yeah, this is a great question, and it is one that we still don't fully understand, or we don't fully know the answer to. So what I can tell you is that, so during the whole time that the dams were present on the ELWHA, hatchery populations elsewhere did maintain some of that genetic integrity of the original ELWHA populations. We don't know exactly where, that because a lot of things happen out in the ocean, they mix and mingle, and some fish might have gone up different tributaries. But the short answer is some of that genetic memory, so the imprinting, was likely preserved in hatchery populations. What we don't understand is how immediately after the dams were removed, these fish, after, as you said, 15 generations, hone in on that, what is likely a very small piece of genetic information. So it's obviously a very powerful signaling that can be preserved at a small scale. So really amazing. And I think I mentioned in the chat that I can follow up via email, via Casey, with some more up-to-date resources that provide some of that recent research, but there's still a lot we don't understand, and it's incredible.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Chelsea and Chris. I'm going to wrap it up here since we are hitting 12:45 right now. Thanks to everyone for joining us for this wonderful virtual field trip with WNPF and Olympic National Park. If you haven't seen yet, we have a brand new website that we launched this year, and there are a lot of new additions and upgrades that we've made. So head over to WNPF.org. If you'd like to sign up for future virtual field trips, make a donation to the parks, or learn about current and previous projects that we're fundraising for. Thank you again, everyone. Thanks to Chelsea and Chris for this awesome presentation. This will be recorded and posted on our YouTube channel, so keep an eye out within the next 24 hours. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you next time.